This is episode 33 of That Shakespeare Life.
So hi, I'm François Larocque, Emeritus Professor of English Literature and Early Modern Drama at Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle, Paris 3, Paris 3. I am the author of Shakespeare's Festive World. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. So it's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
The cittern. It's a little like the ukulele in that it had what is called a reentrant tuning. In other words, it goes down and then back up again, and you strum it. And that was a very, very common instrument for people to just play for fun.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Not many of us think of Shakespeare's plays as examples of great musicals, but from A Midsummer Night's Dream to even Macbeth, Shakespeare uses music, song, and instrumental accompaniment as a dramatic device that spurs forward the story of the play and quite often comments on the actions of the players themselves with songs, dances, and even musical flourishes to introduce or follow the exit of characters in the play. Here today to help us explore the historical music of William Shakespeare's stage production is our special guest, Mary Springfels. Mary Springfels is the founder and former director of the Newberry Consort. A veteran of the early music movement in America, she has performed and recorded extensively with such ensembles as the New York Pro Musica, the Waverly Consort, Concert Royal, Sequentia, Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra, the Seattle Baroque Orchestra, Music of the Baroque, and many, many others. She served as the artistic advisor at the Chicago Opera Theater and is much in demand as a teacher and player in summer festivals throughout the U.S., among them the San Francisco and Amherst Early Music Festivals, the Conclave of Viola de Gamba Society of America, the Pinewoods Early Music Week, and the Texas Toot. She has recently performed with the Sonoma Bach Festival, as well as the Ars Lyrica of Houston. Mary joins us today to discuss her article for the Encyclopedia Britannica titled Music in Shakespeare's Plays that discusses the history of Tudor music and Shakespeare's application of that culture to performance. Mary, welcome to the show. For stage and for film, the idea of a soundtrack has become rather ubiquitous in performance art. But did music play a similar role in performance and theater for William Shakespeare?
We don't think so. For one thing, all the characters tend to react to music as they hear it or call for it in some way. And that is, of course, very different. It would be interesting in a horror movie to have Jamie Lee Curtis stop and say, wow, that's really scary music. And that kind of thing didn't happen. People really, really interacted. That is, the actors on stage within their scripts interacted with the music. They call, as I say, for instance, at the beginning of Twelfth Night, the mercurial Orsino, Duke Orsino, asks for music and then says, well, stop that. Don't play that. So there are things like that that are very, very typical of the plays.
That's very funny. I didn't realize that he was actually talking to, I was always confused by that. Like, who is he talking to tell them to quit playing music?
Well,
so
it's a good question, actually, because we're not quite sure where these musicians were placed. Normally we think of them as being in a gallery above the stage in a place like the Globe, and there was a gallery also in Blackfriars, which was the much coveted indoor theater. But it could have been for that play, nothing is said, at least in the folio, about where these guys were who were playing, but they were somewhere where he could hear them.
Well, when Shakespeare has Pyramus and Thisbe perform their musical interlude during A Midsummer Night's Dream, what was it about the culture of Tudor drama and the role of music that makes this scene so sarcastic?
Well, the only bit of it, as I remember, that is actually musical in Pyramus and Thisbe, the play within the play, is that it is a little bit like a Shakespeare play in that there's a little bit of a trumpet fanfare for poor old Peter Quince to come out and stutter through his prologue. And then at the very end of the play, Bottom, I believe, says, would you like an epilogue or a bergamasque? He asks Duke Theseus of that. And because the play is what it is, Theseus says, oh, no. You can go on with the bergamasque. There is one other thing that could have happened but didn't, which is that after Bottom has kind of recovered from his little interlude with Titania, he says that he would love to turn that into a ballad and would sing the ballad at the end of the play. He would have Peter Quince write the ballad, and it would be called Bottom's Dream. But that never actually happened within that play. I think what you might be asking about also is the style of the play. It's very overblown and very alliterative. At one point, early on in Midsummer Night's Dream, Bottom does this very, very silly little rant called When Griping Grief, and it goes on and on like that in a whole bunch of G's, alliterative G's. And what we do have from other kinds of plays from the period are kind of over-the-top consort songs, which are alliterative like this and have very, very silly lyrics, though the music itself is very beautiful. And the consort songs come from children's plays, which were Shakespeare's primary rivals. Both Shakespeare and other people who were using the outdoor theaters were struggling to keep up financially with these children's plays that took place indoors, and people like to be indoors. And those plays had a bit more music in them. And often that music was called a consort song, which meant that a singer, mostly a kid, would sing to the accompaniment of something, probably viols, viola da gambas. And so that's one of the kind of evidences we have that Pyramus and Thisbe was a satire of other kinds of plays that were going on in London at the time.
Well, the inclusion of a jig is a common musical association for Shakespeare's plays, and it's tied to performance like Hamlet originally, but the jig itself has this reputation for being quite bawdy and disrespectful. But court performances before royalty were not, presumably, including bawdy material. So were there different kinds of music accompanying the same Shakespeare performance depending on where it was performed?
I think that's possible, yeah. It's a good question. Again, going back to A Midsummer Night's Dream, that play was performed, if you think about it, indoors, quote unquote, in that Duke Theseus's house or palace is specifically mentioned as they are called, the rude craftsmen, or the craftsmen who are putting together Pyramus and Thisbe, talk about whether it was a moonlit night. They look at an almanac to find out, to see whether the moonshine would be coming in the casement window of the palace. So we know that the play was indoors. And they do not end their play with a jig. They end it with this dance called a bergamasque, which is a dance from Bergamo, and it was just one of the many court dances that people indulged in at the time. We also know that jigs got rowdier and rowdier as time went on, and for that reason, even theaters like the Globe began to ban them from performances. This would be after Shakespeare's death, sometime in the 17th century. They just got too out of hand. They were not precisely disrespectful, but they were very funny and very subversive. One of the sad things about them, however, is that almost none of them survive. And if they do, they survive on the continent, often in German, because those famous clowns, Will Kemp and Tarleton, on off seasons would go to Europe and perform jigs and very, very boiled down versions of Shakespeare plots, and created an entire little jig and comic industry, especially in Germany. The few jigs that we have are in German. Actually, there's only one. We know the tunes to which they were performed, or some of the tunes, but we actually don't have any jigs.
What's the one that we know about?
There's one called Brother Roland, and it is a kind of classic what was your wife doing over at your house, over at my house kind of thing.
Right.
And it's a dialogue between two characters, and they're just kind of minimally accompanied by either a fiddle or a guitarn, and normally a jig, if it's a long enough one, has maybe 3 tunes that are just repeated over and over again throughout the length of the jig.
I know the jig would be most often performed by the comical character in the company, like Richard Tarleton or Will Kemp, who played characters like Falstaff and a clown. And I think of those characters as being really good at comedy. But if they could also... well, if they could also perform jigs, though, does that mean that there was this high level of interdisciplinary training among actors in a company? Was it necessary for them to be able to act, sing, and perform music?
Absolutely. How much dancing they did is up for question. Mostly jigs were sort of a step in place rather than an acrobatic dance. But yes, indeed, all kinds of people had to sing. The broad comedians, like Tarleton and Kemp, were very good at slapstick. They were also very hard to control on stage, evidently. They would take a line and run with it. There was a lot of extemporizing, for which they were notorious, and they had to be kind of kept in line, but they would really play to the audience in remarkable ways. But there were other kinds of singers, too, depending on who Shakespeare or any of the other playwrights had at the time who sang well, they would write songs for them. For instance, whatever child played Ophelia had to be able to sing a great deal. There was also later in Shakespeare's time a wonderful singing actor called Richard Arman, who was himself a playwright, and he could do very complicated dramatic things and sang most of the important songs in the later plays.
In her article for Encyclopedia Britannica, Mary writes that Shakespeare was selective about who he gave singing parts to in a production, saying, quote, "Major figures never sing, except when in disguise or in distracted mental states. Most songs, in fact, are addressed to the protagonists themselves." Mary, why is it that the major characters never break out into song for Shakespeare?
We can't actually answer that in any kind of coherent way, and I would like to point out that article was written quite a while ago, and there are people who have done a lot of homework since then and might come up with better solutions to those questions. I would like to either rewrite that article or have the Britannica hire somebody else to do it. But as far as we know, that still holds true. You know, Hamlet does not break into song. Othello does not break into song. But Ophelia, when she is mad, sings a kind of series of little shreds of folk songs. The same thing is true for Desdemona's waiting lady, I believe, sings the Willow Song, which is a pre-existing song. Clowns sing, and they can be very important characters, like Feste in Twelfth Night. But nevertheless, the people, Macbeth does not break into song, and it would be very strange to think about that. But these are conventions that were established probably a bit before Shakespeare's time, but seem to hold throughout the entire period up to the closing of the theaters just before the Civil War. It just is a convention, if you want to put it that way.
I think you've just given someone the idea to make Macbeth the musical, but...
Well, it was made into a musical. It was made into a very famous opera. I mean, it's interesting that along with what was going on in England, people were beginning to write opera. So if you think of it, the first opera, which was Perry's Eurydice, was just about 1600. I think it was just at the turn of the 17th century. And so there were people making musicals of important mythological stories and things like that.
Oh, I'm going to go and find that. Well, did Shakespeare write the songs that we see in his plays, though? Where did he get the music that appears in his plays?
A lot of them were already around. And we would think of "O Mistress Mine" is probably a piece sung by Feste in Twelfth Night that probably already existed. Another one, "Take, O Take Those Lips Away," which is a gorgeous piece, perhaps by John Wilson, seems to have existed independently of the play. There may be a few songs that were written by Shakespeare, but none of them have music. They only exist with their verse.
In Shakespeare's plays, it's not a passing inclusion of a musical reference that occurs. In plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream with the fairies singing multiple songs, as well as in Macbeth with the songs of the three witch sisters, music is a core part of the performance. So why are Shakespeare's plays today not often performed, or at least not billed as, musicals?
I think that's a great question, and we should both put our heads together and think of what a musical is. And what would you say constitutes a Broadway musical? It can be a new one or an old one. It could be Hamilton or it could be Oklahoma. What makes it a musical for you?
For me, I would think a musical uses the music to advance the plot. It's how they tell the story.
I think that's absolutely right. And, going back to your other question about who sings in a musical, everybody sings. All the heroes and heroines sing. And musicals and operas are very, very closely related. I would say in a musical there's a little bit more dialogue. In Shakespeare, there is mostly dialogue. There is rarely any more than, if you spread it out all over the play, more than 15 or 20 minutes devoted to music. Even the most musical of plays like The Tempest, which has a great deal of what is called masked music and other things are called for throughout the play. But it's just not enough music to be a musical. And if you think about it, the tradition that was embraced by people not only like Shakespeare, but Thomas Middleton and Beaumont and Fletcher, the people who just followed him and sometimes actually wrote with him, is a very curious one, where no matter what the play is, there will be a little musical interlude in it. And that strikes us as being very curious. In other words, in the middle of a tragedy, there will be some little bit of music, a snippet of a song, sometimes a full-length song. Obviously, in the comedies, there's a great deal more music than in the tragedies. Lear, for instance, has only one little song, which is probably a pop song or perhaps a folk song. Hard to tell the difference. That is sung by the Fool, again, and it was probably Armin, the man I mentioned before, who played the Fool in Lear. And he does sing a little bit, but it's a very, very odd practice. As I say, it's not unique to Shakespeare. All of these guys did it.
Well, here where I live in Alabama, there's a theater downtown called the Alabama Theater, and it's famous for the organ, which comes down and plays as a prelude to any performance there. That has a historical precedence, but we all declare our love for this organ and its music. But what's funny is that as an audience, we don't necessarily like organ music for organ music. We don't go to organ concerts, for example. We love this instrument because culturally that instrument represents something valuable to us. And as I was studying this part of Shakespeare's history, that association as an audience member to a performance made me wonder if there were instruments for Shakespeare's audience which might have been used similarly. Were there specific kinds of instruments for a 16th, 17th century audience that Shakespeare would have routinely used, or that maybe the audience would have expected to be present during a performance?
There are several kinds, actually. In terms of the instruments that everybody could have played, on the upper end, it would have been a little keyboard instrument, very much like a harpsichord. It was a version of a harpsichord called the virginals. And it's a little rectangular instrument that's kind of easy to fit into a domestic space. Queen Elizabeth played the virginals, which are a beautiful and very fluty-sounding harpsichord. Shakespeare refers to the virginals or other keyboard instruments that imply that they're plucked, not an organ, in other words, but a plucked instrument, that they show up in the sonnets all the time. The other difficult instrument, it's difficult to learn to play, that everybody knew about was the lute. And in Ophelia's Mad Scene, originally, that is in a quarto, there are stage instructions that she is to appear with a lute and play it. Most of the time, we don't actually see performers accompanying themselves. It doesn't mean they didn't. We don't know, for instance, whether Feste, the clown that I've mentioned, played another instrument that was a little more common to white and blue-collar workers. It was an instrument called the cithern, and it was a wire-strung instrument that's a little like the ukulele in that it had what is called a reentrant tuning. My dog has fleas. In other words, it goes down and then back up again, and you strum it. And that was a very, very common instrument for people to just play for fun. The other instrument that everybody played for fun was the recorder. And it is mentioned very, very often in Shakespeare. The most well-known reference to it is Hamlet when he's kind of taunting Ophelia before the play within the play, talks about the recorder as being sort of almost as easy as sex. You know, it's just the easiest instrument in the world to play. And so there are many other examples of references to the recorder in Shakespeare because it's a very easy instrument to learn.
Do any of the songs Shakespeare used in his plays survive today? Do we have any left?
We think there are about 100 songs of various kinds that are either mentioned or performed in the plays, of which about 5 actually might have been performed as such on a stage. There was a guy called Robert Johnson, Jonson, who was an exact contemporary of Shakespeare's, who wrote settings of the Tempest songs, and they are our best bet. Take, Oh Take, Those Lips Away was written by another guy called John Wilson, and the song was used several times, once by Shakespeare and then once by Beaumont and Fletcher. And that is probably a contemporary song. So we've got 3, maybe Mistress Mine, though not in the Morley setting. That's 4. And then there's been some great work done by a guy called Ross Duffin, who is an emeritus professor from Case Western Reserve. And he did a ton of homework about the ballads. Normally you don't hear a whole ballad in Shakespeare. You hear bits of one. But he was very careful to find out which ones were actually around and being performed when Shakespeare was writing. And so we have a whole ballad rep that does or does not get performed in toto in Shakespeare. So Hey Ho, the Wind and the Rain, I think, was a registered ballad. Have you explored at all something called the Stationer's Register in any of your shows?
Well, I think I've looked at when different plays got registered. Beyond that, no.
Yeah, well, everything got registered. And so that's the interesting bit, is that all these ballads got registered, and so you can date all kinds of things through the Stationer's Register. And that's what this guy Ross Duffin did.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, so you can find out all kinds of weird things.
There's so much more to learn. I love it.
It's endless. It is absolutely endless. It's big fun.
Mary, we would love to learn more about this topic. So what are your favorite books and resources that you might recommend for us to be able to learn more?
Okay, there's an oldie but goodie by John Hollander called The Untuning of the Sky. And it is about the ethos of music in Shakespeare's time, how it relates to literally how the planet is held together. And it is a great introduction to all of Shakespeare's comments about music that are, larded throughout all of the comedies and tragedies in history. Somebody has something to say about music. And it is related to just general notions that were floating around there in the Renaissance about what music was and how it literally held the planet together. And it is reprinted in a Dover paperback and is very, very affordable. So that's John Hollander, The Untuning of the Sky.
I'm writing it down as you're saying it, and we will definitely add that to today's show notes. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible.
Yeah, unfortunately, it actually would be all the plays. I think if it came right down to it, it might be Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is endlessly fascinating. It can be read over and over and over again, and you don't actually have to know Latin to do it. So there might be that. Here in Santa Fe and in a Dante reading club. And it could be Dante, except that you really, really, really need to speak the language, which I don't. So it might be Ovid.
Excellent choice. Definitely for Shakespeareans, as Shakespeare nodded to that one.
Well, it's also just great stories that you can read over and over and over again. It's endlessly entertaining. So that might be it.
Good choice. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, all kinds of things. There are a couple of Shakespeare things. I'm going to be playing with the Folger Consort in D.C. for their Christmas show, which is all English medieval through Renaissance music, and that should be big fun. Here in Santa Fe, I have a group called Several Friends, and we're doing a sort of semi-staged production of a medieval protest musical, if you want to call it that. There's a lot of singing in it, called the Roman de Fauvel, about an incompetent jerk who becomes the head of the French government. And from it is derived the phrase to curry favor, because Fauvel was an ass. He was a donkey who rises to the heights of power. So we're going to do that. More in line with Shakespearean things, a new friend of mine is a man called John F. Andrews, who runs something called the Shakespeare Guild. And John was the head of academic programs at the Folger for many years and is interested in other kinds of authenticity. And what we're cooking up in the long term is to work with guys in England who have been dealing with original pronunciation and its impact on what you hear. And we're going to do, even if it's only a scene, a sort of take no prisoners Shakespeare that will be original pronunciation, the gestures that go with original pronunciation. We've got lots of information from the Tudor period about what you're supposed to do with your body while you're talking. And we're going to try to get some really, really authentically made reproductions of the instruments and just do a little bit by candlelight with just everything as close to for real as possible.
That is so fascinating. Is this going to be available somewhere, or do you have to attend in person?
Well, we don't know. It depends on how much money we can raise. We're thinking at this point of doing a conference next year, putting this thing together the year after that, and filming it and, offering it as a teaching tool.
Well, that sounds brilliant. Mary Springfels, we are delighted to hear about this, and we'll definitely be following the news on these developments as you pull them together. Thank you so much for being here today and for talking with us. This has been an exciting conversation.
Well, thank you so much for asking me, and it's been a great pleasure.
I've included a bunch of extra history in the show notes for today's episode, including pictures of many of the historical instruments Mary mentioned in today's episode. You'll see the cittern and the recorder, and you'll find references to where in Hamlet he talks about that to Ophelia. All of those references, as well as more information on Mary and her work, can be found at casticash.com/episode 33. That's casticash.com/EP33. In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford-upon-Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all of the details about the trip at casticash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.